You have to find that balance of, look, obviously Billboard has events and conferences and an award show that incorporates talent. At the same time, we are an editorial property that will report on, major controversies and getting scoops and going behind the scenes of, different factions of the music industry. I think that requires a very delicate balance. And I think it requires the right type of music journalist who is unafraid of, working with different parties, but also equally unafraid of telling stories the right way and not saying, oh, we'd love to tell this story, but this artist is going to be at a conference. Like, there's always kind of risk, and there's always kind of, sensitivities that we have to be aware of to some degree. But again, I think it's up to us to supersede those sensitivities with telling stories the right way.
What's going on? Welcome to The New Music Business. I'm your host, Ari Herstand, author of How to Make It in the New Music Business. The book, 3rd edition, is out now. All formats, hardcover, ebook, audiobook, all of that. Today, my guest is Jason Lipshutz. He is the executive director of music at Billboard. He has written about music for over a decade, actually around 15 years, I think, and penned cover stories on Taylor Swift, U2, Blink-182, Lorde, Bon Iver, Mumford Sons, among many others. And he just released a book about Linkin Park called It Starts With One. And we talk about this. It's a great book. I read it and listened to it. And there's an audio version of it, which was fun to listen to that he reads. So we talk a bit about the book. We talk about him covering Linkin Park and why. Admittedly, and I mentioned this, is like, I didn't grow up necessarily a Linkin Park fan, but this book was really fun to listen to and to read. And, I became a fan by the end of it. It was a lot of fun. But we spent a lot of the time actually talking about the state of music journalism and just kind of how he approaches conducting interviews, interviewing artists, who decides what is going to get reviewed and written about and printed and who goes on the cover and all of that. And really just kind of the state of music journalism of where we're at right now. Trade stories a little bit on, trying to get publicists and managers to squash stories and all of that. And Jason, he is, if you don't know him by name, you've definitely read a lot of his work. If you've read anything about music and Billboard over the last 10, 15 years, because he's written so much. You can find the book. It is out everywhere. It's called It Starts With One by Jason Lipshutz, and it's audiobook, physical book, however you like to consume books, you can find his book. You can find all of us that make the show happen at Ari's Take on all the socials. Find me at Ari Herstand on Instagram. But right now, visit aristake.com. Get on the email list. That's the best way to stay in touch. The most up-to-date information about the new music business, we'll send you via email. Get on that email list. We'll let you know when new episodes are out. But right now, if you could just pause this, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you haven't yet, give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. All the stuff. All right, let's kick into the show. Jason Lipshutz, welcome to the show.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, first off, congratulations on your new book, your first book. I see. I'm curious, as someone who's written so many Billboard cover stories and just articles in general, covering artists. What was the process like, and how did it differ from writing this long form book, this biography of a band, versus a normal cover story that you would approach? And how did this process differ, and how did it go?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest difference, the way I've described it in the past, is it was much more like a marathon instead of a sprint, where, for a cover story, you have a couple weeks to work on it. You talk to a handful of people, you gather information and sources and put together different interview pieces and context. And then you're done after, for Billboard, our cover stories usually run around 3,000 words, 3,500. That was basically like a chapter in this book. And there are 25 chapters. So it was a much more in-depth process. And yeah, I mean, it was definitely a learning experience for me. I think the hardest part of actually writing this book in terms of process was just the pacing of like giving myself enough time to finish writing different chapters. And then some chapters took longer than expected. So figuring out how to budget time accordingly. So yeah, in terms of after doing this for a decade plus at Billboard, I had the storytelling tools pretty much in place, but just in terms of the length and the time commitment, that was definitely a learning experience.
Did you write this in a linear fashion? Did you map it out that way, or did you kind of jump around?
Yeah, I wrote it chronologically. The only chapter that I did not write in order is chapter 7, which is about the song One Step Closer, because I wrote the bones of that chapter as basically part of my book proposal, basically writing a sample chapter. And then I went kind of back to it and retooled some things, but it was mostly intact. The rest of it, was front to back in terms of, and the book is chronological. That was actually the biggest change in terms of outlining versus actually writing. Was there were parts of the book where I was going to skip around a little bit in terms of the story of Linkin Park. There was going to be much more like flashing forward, flashing back to side projects and different singles and tours and stuff like that. Once I started getting into it, it just made more sense to go chronological. So that's really how it took place.
Yeah. I like that story of One Step Closer. And I mean, even throughout of just kind of how songs evolved and came from demos and they changed names, not the band. I mean, the band changed names a few times, but the songs changed names and how it came to be. And I liked how you tell the story of, he's, I forget where they were, but Dave was he was like just in his guitar tinkering on a riff in the back of the van. And then Mike, I think Mike leans over. He's like, wait, that's it. Wait, save that riff, record that. We need that. And that turned into One Step Closer. And then like how they didn't want to release that song as a lead single because all the suits in the room and their producer didn't understand rap. And so they're like, well, we understand hard rock and let's make you a hard rock band. And then, but then Chester put his foot down and said, no, we're going to release this because Mike, we need, this is a 2-man fronted project and we want both of our voices equally. And it was a really nice story and kind of how you place that in there as why they chose One Step Closer as kind of their Closer as their lead-off single. Yeah, that was very cool.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, it was, to me, the most fascinating thing about that is the tension between all of these label executives having an opinion of what the band should be and then them having their own opinion. Because to me, putting myself in their shoes for a second, like they had been grinding away for multiple years at that point. And at some point, the impulse is to say, whatever, like what you guys think this is better to just be a hard rock band, to change the focus, to do this, that. Fine. We've been grinding away unsuccessfully for multiple years. We're gonna give in. And I'm sure a lot of bands have done something akin to that in the past. But the fact that they really believed in that DNA of the band was, that was so compelling to me and ultimately produced One Step Closer and then Hybrid Theory.
Right. And I mean, especially after their horrendous Whiskey A Go Go showcase, where I loved how you told that story when they were, the band Zero. I guess there was their first, or no, it wasn't their first show ever, because the first show ever at Whiskey was their opening slot, which they had to pay to play, which, was nice to hear that you're talking about the pay to play existed in the 90s then, and it's not just today where bands are suffering through this pay to play phenomena, but like they actually had to sell their own tickets for that show too. But the actual label showcase when they were back at the Whiskey how their former lead singer just could not, it just was off key, couldn't deliver, and it just didn't work out. When the lights turned back on, the room was basically empty and everyone had left. And it's like, after that, I feel like I would have thrown in the towel. If that happened to me, I was like, fuck, this is over. This is done. Music career, goodbye.
Well, and that's the fascinating thing as well about that part to me is like, at some point they made the decision to move on from Mark Wakefield, who now is a really successful hard rock manager. And obviously Mark reportedly was upset that they moved on without him, but also at the same time, he was like, who knows if this is going to be anything? Like, maybe I'm moving on from nothing. And ultimately he found a lot of success and they kind of, had this lightning strike with a friend of a friend who knew Chester Bennington, who was in, Arizona. He wasn't even like kicking around the same spots as them.
He had quit music by the time they gave him the call. He was done with music. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about his backstory and just the fact that he just needed some solid ground after, touring multiple years in grade A's and that band not really going anywhere outside of the local scene. And he was recently married. He was just like, look, I need something stable. And then, and then he gets the call and everything gets upended.
Yeah. Right. I need something stable. How about a touring life as a rock star? Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah, it's funny because I listen to a lot of this at the gym as I'm like going through, the weights, and I got my headphones on and I'm doing this. And by the way, you did a great job narrating the audiobook.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
And well, I guess first off, before we get into that, was that a decision that was that important to you to narrate the audiobook, or was that something that did they want someone else to do it?
No, they basically gave me the option. My publisher basically said, you can either narrate it yourself or we'll hire a voice actor. And I wanted to narrate it myself. It's my first book. I wanted to try it out and have my voice be the one that people hear because, especially with the intro and some of the kind of more personal reflections, I definitely wanted my perspective to come through. So it was interesting. It was a very difficult, narrating an audiobook, man. It's no joke. It is hours and hours. It's basically like learning a whole new skill because you're learning how to be a voice actor instead of a writer. It's one thing if, you and I talking on this podcast, having a conversation, it's totally different to be reading a book and make sure you're enunciating every single syllable and just having to go back. It was like, whoa, it was intense. But yeah, I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah. After day 5 and this hour number 6 of day 5, words don't make sense. You're like, do I know how to speak anymore? Does this I don't even know if these are English words do I know the English language?
It's so funny you say that because there is, and for anyone who's listening to the audiobook, the second Linkin Park remixed album is called Recharged. And I got to that part, I think it was day 4 that I was talking about Recharged. And I was saying the word recharged, lost all meaning in my mind. And so my producer was like, no, you're saying it wrong. I was like, am I? I was like, recharged? Recharged? I was just like, I was out of it. And I'll never think about that word the same way.
No, I feel that. Yeah, we all have those words. Doing this, that's wild. So, kind of going through the process of putting, I guess, this book together, but more so you come from a long, now I guess it's a long history of interviewing artists, and you have a lot of experience interviewing artists. I guess in general, not necessarily just with Linkin Park, but how do you approach interviews? How do you prepare for them? How do you set them up? How much is in your control, whether you want them to be in person or virtual or over the phone? And what to you gets a great interview?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in terms of circumstance, it's always kind of changing depending on the story, depending on the situation, where ideally you always want them to be in person. Sometimes you have 5 minutes on a grainy phone line. Sometimes it's Zoom cutting in and out. You just kind of have to be prepared for anything. Especially for a long feature, my prep is just research as much as humanly possible, game out different questions. And then my biggest tip that I give to aspiring journalists is to know your questions and your kind of subjects forward and backward to the point where you're not looking down at your notes ever. And that's really what I do, especially for any kind of cover story that I write, any kind of in-depth story, is just what I do is my personal process is I will type up a bunch of questions and then I will handwrite them onto a notebook. And I will have the notebook with me as almost like a life jacket in case I absolutely need something or my mind blanks. But 9 times
Right.
out of 10, I will not look at the notebook, and I will just kind of engage in conversation. And yeah, I think the main thing that I try to do is make every long interview, especially, pretty natural of a conversation where I'm not kind of abruptly jumping into different topics. I'm trying to steer conversation and get what I need in terms of an interview, but also make everything feel as natural and as comfortable as humanly possible for an interview subject. So yeah, I mean, in terms of this book, especially for the interludes with the other artists that are kind of presented in the book as told to interviews, that was my process. I think most of them happened either on Zoom. I think a couple happened over the phone, but most of them were on Zoom, and just kind of, hopping between questions, letting artists just tell their story and not kind of jump in.
Oh, so that was an interview part of it. I was curious about the interlude sections, if they just kind of sent in their story that they wrote, but you actually sat down and interviewed them, and then you transcribed that interview for it.
Yeah, they were all conversations that were condensed and edited for clarity. Yeah, I mean, it was such a blast putting those together. They're basically collaborators and touring artists that have joined Linkin Park and could kind of share their insights of what makes them so special. And yeah, those were all conversations, and they were really powerful. I mean, you talk to, Ryan Shuck of Orgy and Julian Kay, who formed Dead by Sunrise with Chester, about, becoming one of his best friends. The emotions are going to really run high. And so my job in those was just to kind of clear out and let them tell their stories that way.
Sure. Does your process vary if the interview is going to be on camera, or if it's just for you to transcribe later for a feature editorial, or just a written only piece?
Sometimes. I mean, I think it depends on the circumstance to some degree, because at Billboard, I do a lot of on-camera stuff. I do a lot of Zoom stuff. I do a lot of off-camera stuff. Yeah, I think in terms of I try to be as flexible as possible, and I'll maybe be a little bit more casual when I know that, it's going to be me writing something versus me being on camera. It's just a matter of flexibility, and yeah, I mean, and part of it is just time. Like I was way worse at this 15 years ago when I was just kind of starting out and figuring out how to hop between questions and find different modes of interviewing. It takes time and finding a level of comfort where you can kind of hop on with anybody and feel at ease to some degree.
In terms of music journalism over the last 15 years, how would you say it has evolved, and in what ways?
Yeah, and I've seen it evolve. I mean, the short answer is that it has shrunk to a dramatic degree where, when I was starting out, and I started interning at Billboard in 2008, so it's been a minute, there were just a lot more voices in terms of kind of major outlets. Sure. And now there are much fewer major outlets doing real music journalism. However, I wouldn't say that there are fewer voices. They're just presented in much more independent fashion, where people on Substack, people have podcasts, people are people like you, like who are kind of asking questions in new school ways, incorporating multimedia. I think that back then it was much more kind of traditional blogosphere, newspaper and magazine, and now it's definitely evolved. And I think that in terms of the actual practice of music journalism, I think that we've also seen the shrinking of access, and there are much fewer, kind of tell-alls and real going behind the curtain moments. You see much more, email interviews and very kind of heavily edited pieces and things like that. And that's a bummer, obviously, but also sort of makes sense with the rise of social media, where, artists can kind of cut out the middleman and not have to cater to the XYZs that magazines need. And this is something that at Billboard that we grapple with all the time in terms of, telling the right stories, staying dynamic and interesting and urgent, while also, understanding the climate of modern music journalism.
Because that access is a bit more limited these days, is there fear that you and your colleagues at Billboard have in that when you do get access, that you now have this pressure to only write a positive story and make it the most glowing possible thing it could ever be? Otherwise, you won't get that access ever again.
Yeah, I think there's certainly pressure, and I think that it's up to our editorial leadership, who've done a great job kind of stewarding this new era, where you have to find that balance of, look, obviously Billboard has events and conferences and an award show that incorporates talent. At the same time, we are an editorial property that will report on, major controversies and getting scoops and going behind the scenes of, different factions of the music industry. I think that requires a very delicate balance. And I think it requires the right type of music journalist who is unafraid of, working with different parties, but also equally unafraid of telling stories the right way and not saying, oh, we'd love to tell this story, but this artist is going to be at a conference. Like, there's always kind of risk, and there's always kind of, sensitivities that we have to be aware of to some degree. But again, I think it's up to us to supersede those sensitivities with telling stories the right way.
I mean, do you feel like not you personally, but I guess the collective royal you of kind of as the representative of Billboard, but maybe modern journalism, music journalism rather, that it has become more watered down over the last few years, that there aren't as many like you said, tell-alls, but cutting edge stories intentionally because the pressures and because there are fewer people. Like I think of the cover story from what was this? This was probably 2008, 7 or 8, when John Mayer, maybe it was 7. John Mayer's cover stories of Rolling Stone and Playboy, like these two stories hit at like the same time, and it was his cover story of Rolling Stone, and it was basically it just to summarize. I mean, he was kind of. The journalists did a great job of, I would say, accurately relaying the conversations that they had, and they didn't hold back with his antics or his quotes. He notoriously dropped the N-word in those interviews, and it was a train wreck for him. I mean, he went into hibernation for years after that, and I'm curious if that kind of an interview would still, or that kind of a cover story would still exist, because, all the cover stories that I've really read, and maybe this is Billboard, but all the cover stories of Billboard, they're just like glowing, snapshots of the moment of this band. And it's cool. And it's nice to see that, but there's not that. Like, I haven't seen something where they're like, wow, this could literally destroy somebody's career. And it almost did, Yeah,
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's, and I stepping back outside of Billboard and just in modern music journalism, I think you're absolutely correct to say that there are less kind of, critical cover stories, especially. I think there's plenty of criticism online in different forms and fashions, especially if artists take missteps or say the wrong things. I think that, bigger profiles and features, I think, aside from Billboard, just everywhere are a little bit more gentle than they were 10, 15 years ago. I think that's undeniable. I think the bigger thing is that a generation of artists have learned from the mistakes of something like a John Mayer cover story and are much more media trained and media savvy, where, and I think that goes hand in hand with social media, where I think that there's undeniably teams behind the scenes saying like, hey, you don't want to post this, you don't want to say this, you don't want to touch on this, you don't want to comment on this. I think that's undeniable. So I think, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, I think there are hard questions still being asked in different forums. I think that artists and their teams are much more savvy at dancing around harder questions. And look, that's their right. Like, if I were working on an artist camp, I would be preaching the same thing of saying, like, hey, focus on, the art and the music and everything positive, and, don't get yourself in a quagmire a la John Mayer 15 years ago.
Right. Right. Do you feel, as a music journalist, that when you go into these interviews, it is your responsibility to ask cutting questions, ask questions, kind of poke, pry a little bit? Or do you feel it is more your responsibility to sell magazines or get clicks, rather, as it may be these days, and to just paint them in a positive light and tell the story that you think that the artist wants to be told, and that their publicists and their teams and the label wants to tell, and you're kind of an extension of their promotion and marketing?
I mean, I certainly hope that's not how we're viewed. And I think it's definitely upon us, and I include myself and my colleagues, to ask the hard questions. And, I think that I've spent a lot of my career asking questions in a way that is delicate and sensitive, but still ask the questions, just because personally speaking, my approach is always, you're never, if you go in hot, you're probably not going to get the question answered. But if you kind of, demonstrate utmost sensitivity and understanding, while still asking sensitive questions, you're going to get them answered more often. I think but everybody has a different approach. And I think that in terms of myself,
Sure.
you have to ask the questions. Like, I think that there are certain artists and situations where, I've had situations where, an artist, I've had situations where an artist team has asked politely, like, don't touch upon, like, personal issues. And for the most part, Billboard is pretty music and music industry focused, which I actually kind of like, just because that's my area of focus anyway. I don't really care about a breakup. Obviously, people do. I don't really care about, messy personal situations. Sometimes that bleeds into the music and the music industry, and those questions will obviously be asked. But it also depends on the outlet, I guess, is my point, where, a different magazine, a different website might have a different agenda than Billboard, which is trying to tell the story of, different machinations of the music industry like that.
Have you ever had an instance when, after an interview, where whomever's sitting in, the publicist, the manager, comes up to you and be like, yeah, don't use that part, or strike this, or just make sure don't do that? And then, did you listen? Did you feel the pressure? Did you say, I'm sorry, I don't take orders from publicists? Or, like, how do you approach that kind of situation?
Oh man, I would love to be like, I don't take orders from publicists, which is honestly how I operate. But I much more. There's a much more compromise involved in terms of figuring out. If someone says something on the record, I get a gentle ask, like, hey, this is X, Y, and Z reason. Can we strike that? Usually we won't pay attention in terms of, unless it's totally, inconsequential or doesn't really fit into the story at all. I just did an interview a couple weeks ago. I can't say with whom, where something was mentioned. Somebody asked me, this will not be public by the time your story goes up. Can you? And it wasn't even really part of the story. It was very kind of off topic anyway. Wouldn't have made it anyway. Totally fine. Yeah, there are times when, someone will say something on the record. I will get a request to make it off the record, after the fact, and we will say, no, sorry, like this, there'll be a lot of grousing and whining, but it was said on the record, and we're gonna run with it. So yeah, it's always kind of a conversation. But ultimately, what I have learned over my time at Billboard is, there have been times where publicists and managers are furious with me. I'm furious at publicists and managers. What I've learned is cooler heads often prevail, and figuring out like how I can do my job while also not going nuclear and saying like, screw you, I'm going to print this one half sentence. Like that doesn't really benefit me in the long term. Again, I have to do my job and I have to tell a story responsibly and accurately. But I also, know that like, look, at the end of the day, they're just doing their job as well. And so I always try to, treat people with respect and understand like where someone is coming from, even if I disagree with them, even if I can't help them out in certain circumstances.
I mean, do you have any of these horror stories that you'd like to share of somebody going nuclear on you and then you got...
Let's see. I don't think any that I can share. Yeah, I mean, there have certainly been situations where I will mention something in a story that, is presented as just fact and not remarked upon at all. And I will have very furious questions about why that was included. And I was like, look, it's part of the story. It's relevant and it's a fact. And there's no even opinion on my part being like, this artist sucks because of X, Y, and Z, or this artist is great because of X. Like, no, a lot of times we have to present the facts and like that is our job. And I will get, there have been multiple situations where those facts are get me in trouble and get me yelled at, and who cares? Like, that's my job.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I get over the years. I'm sure you've learned to weather that and get some thick skin. I mean, I've had my fair share of publicists and managers come hard at me. I mean, I from one of these interviews, I mean, I'll tell the story because I was super public about it because I don't. Sure. I don't care. I was interviewing Ricky Montgomery, who is a breakout TikTok star, and he was talking about the inner workings of his deal with Warner Records, and I thought it was super fascinating. I'm like, wow, so many people can learn from this. This is incredible. Like he was getting, he's offered a 50-50 licensing deal, and it's a major record deal, and this is like unheard of, and like, holy shit, this is a new wave of deals that are happening in the new music business, and like major record deals. It was licensing and it wasn't ownership. It was like, holy, like it was like blowing my mind. I'm like, wow, you are breaking news right now. Like, this is wild. Yeah. And the Warner publicist was on the call, and afterwards she's like, okay, we're gonna have to strike all of this. If you wouldn't mind just sending me this, we're gonna have to like kill this and this and this and strike this and strike this. And I was like, okay, yeah, no, I mean, I listened politely. I was like, all right, thanks, guys, and I shut off. And then they kept following up. And then we published the interview as is. And then they went absolutely berserk on me. I mean, they were, Warner and the publicist was like calling me and yelling at me and like emailing me. It was like, I woke up to like 12 emails from them, like incessantly. And then, phone calls. And I was just like, it was on the record. He said it, he could learn from this. And I like checked in with Ricky. I was just like, listen, I don't want to hurt your relationship with your new label and everything, because it's like, my whole MO about this is to celebrate and advocate for artists and songwriters, and it's not about like getting a gotcha moment with an artist. Like, but like he was super clear. He's like, nah, let the chips fall where they may. Like, that's cool. I don't care. I was like, hell yeah. So it was like, it was one of those things, and then of course, like, I'm a little bit more fiery, I think, than others, and I was like, fuck it. And I sent an email to my entire email list and was like, Warner's trying to get me to remove this interview. You better tap in and listen. It just like, but yeah. Yeah.
I mean, but the thing is, what you just demonstrated in terms of reaching out to Ricky and making sure that like he was cool with it and that you weren't ruining everything, that demonstrates a mindfulness. That's exactly what I'm talking about, which is just like,
yeah.
Even when something is unwanted or, is being, protested in terms of something on the record that shouldn't be on the record and is requested to be off the record, again, you're not saying like, screw you, there's no nuance. Like you're still taking that nuance and saying like, and looking at it from every different angle. And that's kind of what I mean, which is just like, look, I demonstrate or try to demonstrate understanding where like, look, there's only so much rope I can give. But I'm still going to think about, different ways to find a compromise where, somebody's, in this case, in Ricky's case, somebody's day isn't like ruined, and somebody's livelihood isn't ruined. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that publicist day was ruined, and I'm sure she was getting a lot of pressure from her team there, and I'm sure I ruined her day. But at the end of the day, it's just like, I look at the bigger picture of all of this, and it's like it's not just because I have the power to do it. Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. And it's not just to like, stick it to the man, and the man being like Warner Records in this case or whatever. But it was because like, I thought it was really important for the general music community, and specifically the artist community, to understand that this was possible, and maybe it would give them a few more tools to help them in the negotiations, in future record label contract negotiations, and all of that. And like, in the grand scheme, and like, I've had a few of those instances where it was, things were very revealing and helpful, and they tried to, squash it. But I think it's like, and I don't know, I don't call myself a journalist like you. I don't know what I am, but I kind of, I have a platform, and can hopefully pass along some information and support. And I mean, I guess artist advocate at the end of the day is just really what this is all about. I'm curious when, like, just the structure of how Billboard works in terms of fact checking, editorial, like, editors. And so now you're at a far more senior position, but when you started, but I'm curious, just like, when what is that process when someone turns in a piece, whether it's who are the editors above you, or someone turns in a piece to you and you're the editor, and it goes, what's the fact checking process like, and all of that? How does that all work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the easiest answer is that it depends on the story. And when you have a cover story, for instance, we have a dedicated group of editors that are basically in charge of magazine features or any kind of digital cover story, kind of extended feature in that regard. That story gets looked at by multiple editors, then it gets looked at by copy editors, then it gets looked at typically by our editorial director. So it goes through a lot of different eyes, and we don't have like a dedicated fact-checking editor. But it is upon the writer and the multiple editors who check out a story to flag anything, to, if they have any questions on anything, to double check everything, basically, as well as, our copy edit team as well as our editor-in-chief, our editorial director. In terms of like a news story, we have dedicated web editors who are, editing every news story in shifts, as well as editors who are in charge of kind of our business writing and reporting and features. So the easiest answer is that there are different editors in charge of different factions of our reporting. Some of it is broken down by genre, where we have a Latin music reporting team, is a good example. Others are by discipline, where, like I said, much more like industry-focused reporting on labels and streamers and all that stuff.
Cool. And who decides what stories get greenlit, or even what's going on the cover?
It's a lot of communication. It's a lot of different editors in conversation with, where certain stories need to fit, what makes sense for different, parts of the magazine, parts of the website. Because, like I said, there are editors who are thinking about cover stories. There are editors who are not, who are just totally focused on, different machinations of the music industry and how to report on them. And then there are editors who are like, hey, this got announced, this tour got announced, this new album got announced, this got said, and posting news stories, because, we're first and foremost a news organization. Like, if you look at our web traffic, the majority of the top stories are kind of quick hit news stories, just because that's kind of our bread and butter on a day-to-day basis, in addition to kind of the longer features. And then also, I should also mention that we have kind of extensive editorial lists, whether it's, a year-end top albums or songs list, or much more dynamic list of, we just did the best songs about the music industry. That was a big staff list. So yeah, there's kind of, everyone has a different focus to some degree, and then we're constantly in conversation with each other. And what I like about my job is kind of being an air traffic controller to some degree of, I write for the website and the magazine. I edit for the website and the magazine. I'm managing different writers and editors, and kind of in conversation with their day-to-day and how they manage themselves, and just trying to stay aware of everything that we have going on, and spinning a lot of plates, which I love.
Do you feel that, do you feel pressure from the financial arm of the business? You talked about web traffic, and you said that the hits are, your web traffic is heavily weighted on the news stories and breaking news and stuff like that. That is, those pieces are important, no doubt, but they're so fleeting, of course. And it's like, it's not like, the story that's going to be referenced in history books, or people are going to revisit time and time again throughout the years, whatever that is. And I'm sure those breaking news stories, sure, some writers get excited by them and might chase that, and that's what they love. But I don't imagine that's for every writer, right. And they want to get into the meat and potatoes and do that feature story and fly out to LA and sit down with Taylor Swift at the hotel, like you've done. And so it's kind of like, do you feel the pressures, are there pressures there? Who would they come from? Like, is there any of that influence, I should say, of we need more of this because it drives more traffic, which means more revenue. And if you want to keep your job, we need more hits on the website or whatever. Like, how much influence is that in this whole process?
So what I'll say is that different eras of Billboard and different regimes, there was more pressure, and there was much more kind of, you could feel it on a day-to-day basis of exactly what you're describing, chasing traffic and figuring out where our audience is. And I think that to some degree, we absolutely need to be telling the stories we need to tell in terms of what our audience is interested in, looking at interest levels. That informs a lot of our coverage in terms of news as well as features. But I'm happy to say that over the past few years, Billboard Editorial has been pretty divorced from our sales team, just in terms of, the impetus to drive traffic and, that kind of internal pressure. Obviously, there's constant communication between editorial and sales, and different, arms of Billboard. Billboard events, obviously, is, we're in constant communication with them as well. But I think that we operate best without that kind of day-to-day pressure of just like we're chasing the stories that we need to tell, and there's pressure in that way.
Sure.
So I guess that there is storytelling pressure, but not traffic pressure, if I can make that distinction. And I think that that's the best way to operate. And I give our leadership across the editorial team, as well as, Billboard in general, a ton of credit for kind of insulating us from that pressure and just letting us do our jobs. And I think honestly, without that kind of, pressure for day-to-day clicks, I think we're doing a better job. And, also finding different areas in which we can, build out our storytelling a little bit. I think one example is that we've, through our hires, as well as some of our editorial decisions, we've really leaned into our hip hop and R&B coverage, and made some big lists, including our 50 best rappers of all time list, best rap albums, as
I'm
well
sure
as
that wasn't controversial at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was one
all
of those,
love.
It was one of those things where, it was not about like, we need to produce a best rappers list tomorrow. It was much more about like organic conversation and getting the right people and voices in the room, whether, it's Damian Scott, who's an amazing, writer and journalist and editor who joined our team last year. Gail Mitchell, who is, one of the greatest R&B journalists and hip hop journalists ever, and kind of having them lead an editorial package like that in a really smart way and giving them kind of the time and bandwidth to do so. It's a lot more like that, which is, like I said, kind of finding ways to tell our stories without, the kind of go of like, if we don't hit these traffic goals by the end of the week, we're doomed. Like it's way less doom and gloom. And like I said at the start of this, like it was not always that way. I've been through periods of doom and gloom at Billboard, and I'm very happy to say that we're much more on level ground now.
Great. When you decide to do a feature or an interview with an artist, how much of your, I guess, personal fandom needs to exist for you to take something on? It's no secret that you're a fan of Linkin Park. I'm assuming that's why you kind of chose to write this book, and I like that you told a bit of your personal story when it comes to that. But like, I also watched your interview with Nelly Furtado, and you open it by saying, "I'm a big fan," and she's like, "Really?" And you're like, "No, I am." And I'm thinking the same thing she is. I'm like, "Really? Like, are you a big fan? Are you just saying that? Do you have to be a fan of your subjects to do the interview?"
Absolutely not. No, I am a huge Nelly Furtado fan. I will defend, multiple Nelly Furtado eras.
Cool.
We'll talk about Loose. We'll talk about Spirit Indestructible. Come on. But no, I don't think I think it helps in terms of knowledge and passion in some areas. I think in other areas, it hurts because, if you are a super fan of an artist, it might be harder to ask kind of bracing questions to them. So I think that what I've done and what everybody at Billboard does to some degree is kind of manage their personal tastes and predilections with the work that needs to be done. And, I think like a good example of that is I'm really proud of our Latin music coverage. And Leila Cobo, who is our head of Latin content, she has her own tastes and she has her own favorite artists. But what supersedes them are the most urgent stories being told in Latin music. And that is her job to say like, hey, this artist is interesting. This album is interesting. This song is going to take off. And like, to some degree, we all have to do that. And, I give her as an example because like she very much has been a champion of that world and telling, she was the one who, she's a big Bad Bunny fan, but also before she was a huge Bad Bunny fan, she kind of sniffed him out as like, hey, he's going to be a superstar. Like we have to get him on the cover of Billboard. And, we were the first place to have Bad Bunny on the cover. So I think it's up to us to kind of, like I said, manage those personal tastes and instincts with, our job as journalists. And to your point, like there are times where I will tell an artist I'm a huge fan. Sometimes it kind of helps break the ice a little bit and I can kind of demonstrate like, hey, like, I get where you're coming from. Sometimes I don't. And that's fine. Like, I have to do my job and figure out the best path into that conversation.
Yeah. Cool. I guess getting back to the book, why did you decide to write this book on Linkin Park?
So it's funny because we just talked about being a fan of an artist. I was a Linkin Park fan. I was not a super fan in the sense of knowing every song on every album.
Sure.
There were two things that happened that made me kind of think about writing this book. The first was I was at Billboard, obviously, in 2017 when Chester Bennington passed away. And I was a fan of Linkin Park, but I was devastated when he passed away. Like I in a way that like surprised me. I had a very visceral reaction to the news. And, I was really, really upset. And part of being at Billboard is you have to be desensitized to celebrity passings to some degree because, you have to spring into action and write and report and get reactions and pay tribute in a right way.
Yeah.
Without like, sitting and in your unhappiness for a while. So I was really upset and I kind of filed that away in my mind a little bit. And then in 2020, I talked to Mike Shinoda and Joe Hahn for a big feature on the 20th anniversary of Hybrid Theory, where they broke down every song on the album to me. And it was a blast, man. It was like, it was so much fun hearing those backstories. And I just was like, these guys are amazing storytellers. Like, I didn't know this whole backstory of In the End and how that song came together. I want to learn more about that. And then in 2022, 2 years after that, I was in a conversation with my agent, and we talked about a couple of nonfiction music projects. And I told him, I was like, I can't believe there's not a career-spanning book about Linkin Park. When you think about everything that they accomplished, when you think about how they formed, their debut album selling over 10 million copies. They made an album with Jay-Z. They changed their sound. Like all of these different touch points, and there wasn't a book like that. And, you know, I mentioned that I wasn't a super fan because I think that actually helped me because I was a fan. You know, you can't write a book about someone unless you're a fan of of their music. But I also got to explore their back catalog with fresh eyes. And I thought that was really helpful instead of just being like, every album is amazing. Every song is amazing. Like, there are some songs and some albums that I like more than others. And I think it helped to kind of have that perspective of, you know, objectivity instead of just like diehard fandom. And now, you know, obviously after all this, they're one of my favorite bands, if not my favorite band. But I kind of came into it with fresh ears to some degree.
It was cool. You know, admittedly, I was not a Linkin Park fan. I wasn't a hater. I just like, I think we're about the same age, and I grew up adjacent to this whole scene happening. You know, kids were wearing Korn t-shirts to high school and stuff like that, and I was like, I don't like that. I mean, I was a theater kid. I was singing musicals and listening to Dave Matthews, you know, like that, and like that was my high school experience. Like I was learning how to play Dave Matthews on acoustic guitar. Like I was obsessing over that while they're like, you know, fist bumping in the cafeteria to like Papa Roach and Linkin Park and, you know, Rage and whatever. And so I knew this scene existed. I just was not a part of it whatsoever. You know, I knew In the End because it was playing on at the mall or what. Like it literally, it's funny because last night as I'm going to bed, you know, I told my wife, I'm like, oh, I'm interviewing, you know, the writer of this Linkin Park biography, and she knew I'd been like listening to the book and reading the book. And she's like, man, let me look at that discography. She puts on, we're sitting in bed, and she like starts playing Hybrid Theory. Every single song, she knows every single word. Yeah. And then she's like, oh, I'm like, what the hell? Like, what? Like, she knew every word. And then it wasn't even that. And then she like starts going through the discography and knows, like, she's like, wow, I can't believe I still have all this. And then she like knew every word of every other song she played. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, this is wild. And it was still in there. And I like that you said, you know, towards the end, like, as big as you think Linkin Park is, they're bigger. Yeah. And it's even the streaming numbers that you talk about in the book of the monthly listeners, you know, at the time, I think when you wrote in the book, it was like 37 million monthly listeners or something. You know, now they're at 60 million. I'm granted with like the tour announcements and now that they're touring again and all of that, like I'm sure that juices it up. But it was really surprising as well for me. And as someone who's just like wasn't super familiar with it, I really enjoyed going through this and reading it and listening to it and just like getting to know their story. And you know, I did lump them together with all of these other, with like nu metal and rap rock and hard rock and all of that. And I liked how you made that distinction of why they weren't, you know, why they were so different from Limp Bizkit. And like when you're telling the story from Woodstock 99, which I mean, I watched that documentary and oh, God, it's just
yeah,
oh
wild,
my God. Wild and devastating and just horrible and just all around. But how that, you know, I loved, well, I wrote this down because I want to remember, I loved this line. You said, this is about Woodstock 99. You said, the fires raging for no reason became the perfect symbol of nu metal, the music of pointlessly aggrieved white youth.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you, man. And let me tell you, man, like I wrote about this a little bit in the intro to the book. Like I was right there with that too, because I was, you know, back then. And look, I think like nu metal has, some great music, some awful music, like whatever. But I was also like a 12-year-old suburban white kid with no real problems singing like break stuff and One Step Closer. And like, I had nothing to be angry about, but I definitely like understood that kind of anger for no reason. And yeah, it was so interesting to me because I even forgot in terms of the timeline that like, Woodstock 99 happens, nu metal gets painted in this horrible light. And Linkin Park like wasn't even around then. Like they had not put out their debut single then. That was a year later. So it's interesting that, later in the book, I write about the fact that Linkin Park never really got their kind of critical reappraisal that some other bands that have been around for a while have happened to them, and they get the Grammy nominations and they get kind of reconsidered by the critical community. Linkin Park never did that because I think that a lot of people feel the same way you do, which is just like, before now, they were a nu metal band. Like, and even though, they have 7 albums and 2 of them were really rap rock, then they kind of moved on and changed their sound. But for a lot of people, they kind of remained frozen in that moment of nu metal heinousness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it's a great book, and you did a really great job documenting this through their whole career. And I know that fans are going to really appreciate that now this exists in the world and that this is there. And I think I'm sure super fans are going to love it just as much as someone like me who didn't know really much about them at all and just like really appreciated going through their story and their journey. So great work with it. I really appreciate it and really enjoyed it.
Thank you, man. Thank you. No, totally. I'm glad thank you to everybody who's reached out, including you, just with the kind words, because you're right that I think like super fans are enjoying it, but also people like you who are like, I kind of knew some of it, but also like I'm deeper in it. Like, I wrote it for everybody. So I appreciate the kind words, man. Thank you.
Of course. I have one final question that I ask everyone who comes on the show, and that is, what does it mean to you to make it in the new music business?
To me, it means that I'm part of a community that really honors creativity. And I try to do that as a journalist, where I'm highlighting and telling stories with the lens of, championing artistry and creativity and different modes of presenting music in my case. And also now as an author, being able to kind of tell a story that speaks to, different types of fans and different, like I said, whether you're a casual Linkin Park fan or a diehard Linkin Park fan. And hopefully I can do more of that as an author moving forward with more books. But yeah, that's really, I'm really proud to be, if I step back and think about what I try to do at Billboard, as a reporter, as a journalist, as a writer, it really is, highlighting that creativity, because it's in some ways it's a tough time in the music industry. In a lot of other ways, it's a wonderful time if you know where to look and look under the right rocks. I'm really proud of a lot of friends and artists and subjects who have let that creativity shine. So yeah, man, I think that would be my answer. Is just I'm really happy to champion that artistry.
Awesome. Jason, well, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, man.
Today's episode was edited by Ari Davids, with music by Brassroots District, and produced by all the great people at Ari's Take.